Hello, YouTubers, and welcome to Level-Headed News. This is Brenda, your host, and I have 5 articles for you in this episode this morning. They're all listed, all the URLs are listed in the description of this video for your convenience. The first one here is off of dailymail.co.uk, and it says, Exposed, how world leaders were duped into investigating billions over manipulated global warming data. It can reveal a landmark paper exaggerated global warming. It was rushed through in time to influence the Paris Agreement on climate change. Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration broke its own rules. The report claimed the pause in global warming never existed, misleading, unverified data. The Mail on Sunday today reveals astonishing evidence that the organization that is the world's leading source of climate data rushed to publish landmark paper global warming and was timed to influence the historic Paris Agreement on climate change. A high-level whistleblower newspaper that Americans National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA, breached its own rules on scientific integrity when it published the sensational but flawed report aimed at making the maximum possible impact on world leaders, including Barack Obama and David Cameron, at the UN Climate Conference in Paris in 2015. Claimed that the pause or slowdown in global warming in the period since 1998, revealed by UN scientists in 2013, never existed, and the world temperatures had been rising faster than scientists expected. Launched by NOAA with a public relations fanfare, it was splashed across the world's media and cited repeatedly by politicians and policymakers. Dr. John Bates, a top NOAA scientist, reputation, has shown the Mail on Sunday's irrefutable evidence that the paper was based on misleading, unverified data. It was never subjected to the internal evaluation process which Dr. Bates devised. His vehement objections to the publication of the faulty data were overridden by his NOAA supervisors in what he describes as blatant attempt to intensify the impact of what became known as the Pause Buster paper. Closures are likely to stiffen President Trump's determination to enact his pledges to reverse his predecessor's green policies and to withdraw from the Paris deal, so triggering an intense political row. The interview, Dr. Bates accused the lead author of the paper, Thomas Carl, who was until last year director of NOAA's section that produces climate data, the National Centers for Environment Information, or the NCEI, of insisting on decisions that scientific choices that maximized warming and minimized documentation in an effort to discredit the notion of a global warming pause, that he could time publication to influence national and international deliberation on climate policy. 2 principal scientists at the NCEI based in Asheville, North Carolina. Official delegations from America, Britain, were strongly influenced by the flawed NOAA study as they hammered out the Paris Agreement and committed advanced nations to sweeping reductions in their use of fossil fuel and to spending 80 pounds every year on new climate-related aid projects. The scandal has disturbing echoes of the Climategate affair, which broke shortly before the UN Climate Summit in 2009, when the leak of thousands of emails between climate scientists suggested they had manipulated and hidden data. Some were British experts in the influential Climate Research Unit at the University of East Anglia. 2015 Pause Buster paper was based on 2 new temperature sets of data, measurements of temperatures at the planet's surface on land, the other at surfaces of the sea. Databases were flawed. This newspaper has learned that NOAA has now decided that the C dataset will have to be replaced and substantially revised just 18 months after it was issued because it used unreliable methods which overstated the speed of warming. The revised data will show both lower temperatures and a slower rate in the recent warming trend. The land temperature dataset used by the study was afflicted bugs in its software that rendered its findings unstable. The paper relied on preliminary alpha versions of the data, which was never approved or verified. The approved version has still not been issued. None of the data which the paper was based was properly achieved, a mandatory requirement meant to ensure that the raw data and the software used to process accessible used to process it is as accessible to other scientists so they can verify NOAA results. Dr. Bates retired from NOAA at the end of last year after a 40-year career in meteorology and climate science. As recently as 2014, the Obama administration awarded him a special gold medal for his work in setting new, supposedly binding standards to produce and preserve climate data records. Yet when it came to the paper timed to influence the Paris conference, Dr. Bates said these standards were ignored. The paper was published in June of 2015 by the Journal of Science, entitled Possible Artifacts of Data Biases Global Surface Warming Hiatus. The document said the widely reported pause or slowdown was a myth. Earlier, a blockbuster report from the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC, which drew on the work of hundreds of scientists around the world, had found a much smaller increase. A much smaller increasing trend over the past 15 years, 1998 to 2012, past 30 to 60 years, explaining the pause became the key issue for climate science. It was seized on by the global warming skeptics because the level of CO2 in the atmosphere had continued to rise. Boss, there's a picture of him in this, had a hotline to the White House, association with President Obama, science advisor John Holdren. Pausebuster paper was hugely influenced in dictating the world agreement in Paris and sweeping U.S. emission cuts. President Trump, his picture in there as well, has pledged to scrap both policies, triggering furious claims by Democrats he is climate denier and anti-science. Thanks to today's MOS story, NOAA is set to face an inquiry by the Republican-led House Science Committee. The article continues. It says some scientists argue that the existence of the pause meant that the world's climate is less sensitive to greenhouse gases than previously thought, so warming would be slower. One of them, Professor Judith Curry, then head of climate science at the Georgia Institute of Technology, said it suggested that computer models used to project future warming were running too hot. However, the Pausebuster paper said of global warming from 1950 to 1999 was 0.113 centigrade per decade. The rate from 2000 to 2014 was actually higher at 0.116 centigrade per decade. The IPCC's claim about the pause, it concluded, was no longer valid. The impact was huge and lasting. On publication day, the BCC said the pause in global warming was an illusion caused by inaccurate data. The magazine described the paper as a science bomb dropped on skeptics. Its impact could be seen in this newspaper last month when writing his Ladybird book about climate change. Prince Charles stated, "There isn't a pause. It is hard to reject the facts on the basis of the evidence." The C data set used by Paul and his colleagues known as Extended Reconstructed Sea Surface Temperature version 4, or ERSSTB4, tripled the warming trend over the sea during the years of 2000-2014 from just 0.6 centigrade per decade, as stated in version 3, to 0.099 centigrade per decade. Individual measurements in some parts of the globe had increased by about 0.1 centigrade, and this resulted in the dramatic increase of the overall global trend published by the Pause-Buster paper. It's a tongue twister. But Dr. Bates said this increase in temperature was achieved by dubious means. The key error was an upwards adjustment of readings from the fixed and floating buoys, which are generally reliable, to bring them into line with readings from much more doubtful source, water taken in by ships. Explained, has long been known to be questionable. Ships are themselves sources of heat. Readings will vary from ship to ship. Intake will vary according to how heavy the ship is laden, so affecting temperature readings. Dr. Bates said data from buoys, and they threw it out and corrected it by using the bad data from the ships. You never change good data to agree with bad, but that's what they did, so as to make it look as if the sea was warmer. STB4 adjusted buoy readings to up by 0.12 centigrade. It also ignored data from satellites that measured the temperature of the lower atmosphere, which are also considered reliable. Dr. Bates said he gave the paper co-authors a hard time about this, and they never really justified what they were doing. Now, some of those same authors have produced the pending revised new version of the C database, the SSTV5, a draft of the document that explains the methods used to generate version 5 seen by this newspaper indicates the new version will reverse the flaws in version 4, changing the buoy adjustments and including some satellite data and measurements from a special high-tech floating buoy network known as Argo. As a result, it is certain to show reduction in both absolute temperature and recent global warming. The second database used by the Pause-Buster paper was a new version of NOAA's land records known as the Global Historical Climatology Network, or GHCN, an analysis over time of temperature readings from about 4,000 weather stations spread across the globe. This new version found past temperatures had been cooler than previously thought and recent ones higher, so that the warming trend looked steeper. For the period from 2000 to 2014, the paper increased the rate of warming on land from 0.15 centigrade to 0.164 centigrade per decade. As the Buster paper was published, Dr. Bates conducted a one-man investigation into this. His findings were extraordinary. Not only had Mr. Carl and his colleagues failed to follow any of the formal procedures required to approve and archive their data, they had used a highly experimental early run of a program that tried to combine two previously separate sets of records. This had undergone the critical process known as pairwise homogeneity adjustment, a method spotting rogue readings from individual weather stations by comparing them with others nearby. However, this process requires extensive, careful checking, which was only just beginning, so that the data was not ready for operational use. Now, more than 2 years after the Pause-Buster paper was submitted to Science, the new version of GHCN is still undergoing testing. GHCN software was afflicted by serious bugs. They caused it to become so unstable that every time the raw temperature reading were run through the computer, it gave different results. The new bug-free version of GHCN has still not been approved and issued. It is, Dr. Bates said, significantly different from that used by Mr. Carl and his co-authors. Dr. Bates revealed that the failure to archive and make available full documented data not only violated NOAA rules, but also those set down by Science. Before he retired last year, he continued to raise the issue internally. Then came the final bombshell. Dr. Bates said, "I learned that the computer used to process the software had suffered a complete failure." Is unknown, but it means that the pause buster paper can never be replicated or verified by other scientists. The flawed conclusions of the pause buster paper were widely discussed by delegates at the Paris Climate Change Conference. Mr. Carl had long-standing relationship with President Obama's chief science advisor, John Holdren, giving him a hotline to the White House. Mr. Holdren was also strong advocate of robust measures to curb emissions. Britain's then Prime Minister David Cameron claimed the conference 7% of scientists say climate change is urgent and man-made and must be addressed, and called for by binding legal mechanism to ensure the world got no more than 2 centigrade warmer industrial times. President Obama stressed his clean power plan at the conference, which mandates American power stations to make big emission cuts. President Trump has since pledged he will scrap it and to withdraw from the Paris Agreement. Whatever takes its place, said Dr. Barnes, there needs to be a fundamental change to the way NOAA deals with data so that people can check and validate scientific results. I'm hoping that this will be a wake-up call to the climate scientist community, a signal that we have put in place processes to make sure this kind of crap doesn't happen again. I want to address the systematic problems. I don't care whether modifications to the database make temperatures go up or down, but I want to make the observations to speak for themselves. To be a new emphasis that ethical standards must be maintained. He said he decided to speak out after seeing the reports in the papers, including Washington Post and Forbes magazine, that claiming that the scientists feared the Trump administration would fail to maintain and preserve NOAA's climate records. Dr. Bates said that there is now this idea that Trump is going to trash climate data when the key decisions were earlier taken by someone whose responsibility was to maintain its integrity and failed. But it effectively mounted a cover-up when challenged over its data after the paper was published. The U.S. House of Representatives Science Committee launched an inquiry into its pause buster claims. Reply with subpoenas demanding internal emails from the committee chairman, the Texas Republican Lamar Smith, and falsely claimed that no one had raised concerns about the paper internally. Mr. Smith thanked Dr. Bates for courageously stepping forward to tell the truth about NOAA's senior officials playing fast and loose with the data in order to meet a politically predetermined conclusion. He added, he used flawed data, was rushed to publication in an effort to support the president's climate change agenda, and ignored NOAA's own standards for scientific study. The president of the Climate Forecast Applications Network said last night, large adjustments to the raw data and substantial changes in successive data set versions imply substantial. It was time, she said, that politicians and policymakers took these uncertainties. Last night, Dr. Carl admitted the data had not been achieved when the paper was published. Asked why he had not waited, he said, John Bates is talking about a formal process that takes a long time. He denied he was rushing to get the paper out in time for the saying there was no discussion about Paris. He also admitted that the final approval and operational GHCN land data would be different from that used in the paper. Our SSTV4 set a C data set. He claimed it was other records, such as the UK Met offices, which were wrong because they understated global warming and were based too low. Science's editor-in-chief said Dr. Bates raises some serious concerns. After the results of any appropriate investigations, we will consider our options. He said that could include retracting that paper. To comment, it's not the first time we've exposed dodgy climate data, which is why we've dubbed it Climategate 2, or Climate Gate 2. Dr. John Bates' disclosures about the manipulation of the data behind the pause buster, biggest scientific scandal since Climate Gate in 2009, when, as the paper reported, thousands of leaked emails revealed scientists were trying to block access to data and using a trick to conceal embarrassing flaws in their claims about global warming. Both scandals suggested a lack of transparency and, according to Dr. Bates, a failure to observe proper ethical standards. Failure to archive data used in the paper, its results can never be verified. This scandal is likely to reverberate around the world and reignite some of science's most data. Has there been an unexpected pause in global warming? If so, is the world less sensitive to carbon dioxide than climate computer models suggest? In that truly dangerous global warming is less imminent than politicians' repeated calls for immediate urgent action to curb the emissions are exaggerated. And there's some video in this if you want to pull that up to take a look at that. And that's what I had in that article for you. And I'm going to grab a drink here because that was a lot of talking. I'm kind of parched. The next article I have for you is off of Natural News, and it says, study, ads selling junk food overwhelmingly targeting youth. Even though you, the health-conscious parent, steer your children toward fresh, organic fruits and vegetables and limit their time in front of the TV, junk food ads are still having a tremendous impact on their life. While your kids surf the internet, chat with their friends on Facebook, play with online games, or download an app for their mobile phone, they get bombarded by millions of unhealthy food ads. Over 90% of food and beverage ads viewed by kids and teens are for fast food, energy drinks, sugary snacks, and other unhealthy food and drink options. A report from the Heart and Stroke Foundation of Canada has urged the food industry to stop targeting advertisements for unhealthy products to our kids. As declared by the Heart and Stroke Foundation, these commercials are significantly influencing food choices of our children and teens, setting them up for unhealthy eating habits for the rest of their lives. Kids see 25 million a year. For their study, the researchers used ComScore data to determine the top 10 websites visited by children and teens. Focusing on the number of banners and pop-up ads on these sites, the researchers calculated that children see around 25 million ads for unhealthy foods and drinks a year, while teens view about 2.5 million ads. The authors of the report said this enormous difference is because teens visit a much wider array of websites, resulting in fewer visitors to the top 10 sites compared to younger kids. While this study is a good indicator, Monique Potvin-Kent, who led the research and is an assistant professor at the University of Ottawa School of Epidemiology, Public Health, and Preventative Medicine, said that the actual number of ads children are exposed to is much higher. Next to online advertisements, the report also noted that an average child watches about 2 hours of TV each day and sees up to 5 food and beverage commercials an hour. Do the math. That's about an additional 3,600 plus views on top of millions of online ads kids see every year. Given the severe impact of these commercials have on our children's behavior and health, the Heart and Stroke Foundation group has called for strong restrictions on the marketing of food and drinks to your younger generation. Going to stop. Last year, Senator Nancy Green Rain introduced an act to restrict unhealthy food marketing to young children. In the past, voluntary commitments by food industry to limit unhealthy food marketing to youth has resulted in one big failure. The food companies that voluntarily signed the national pledge not to market unhealthy foods to kids under 12 are found to be the heaviest advertisers of products high in fat, sugar, and salt. Some of these companies include Coca-Cola, Kraft, PepsiCo, Hershey, and McDonald's. Monique Potvin-Kent noted that there are several flaws in the current commitment that allow these big food corporations to continue to market their unhealthy food and drinks. Nearly all 18 companies that signed the agreement only restrict unhealthy food advertisements when the audience consists of 35% or more children under 12, thus allowing them to proceed with most of their marketing campaigns. Furthermore, it is the companies themselves that set the nutrition criteria for their products. As reported by the Globe and Mail, food items such as chocolate, Lucky Charms, Fruit Roll-Ups, Fruit Loops, and Happy Meal from McDonald's fall under the healthier options, which can be marketed to kids. Sasha McNicol, Coalition for Healthy School Food coordinator at Food Secure Canada, said that the evidence presented in the report clearly shows a new law regarding advertising restrictions is urgently needed to protect kids and support parents. If we don't need legislation, why are a third of Canadian children overweight or obese? She said. Voluntary response don't work. We need to legislate this in order to see results. The next article that I have for you is off of Natural News. It says, taking OxyContin drug maker to court over gross negligence, creating public nuisance and other misconduct. City lawyers in Everett, Washington are preparing to sue the makers of OxyContin, a leading painkiller, blaming it for its role in the United States opioid and heroin epidemic. The city filed a lawsuit against Purdue Pharma, claiming they knew the drug was being illegally trafficked to residents and did not act to stop it. From 2011 to 2013, Snohomish County experienced unusually high numbers of deaths, 6 to 8 deaths per 100,000 people, related to opioid analgesic, particularly oxycodone and hydrocodone, and heroin, according to a report by the Snohomish Health District. Washington's state average was between 3 and 5 deaths. A cheap drug that has recently replaced opioid painkillers as the primary agent in overdose deaths and addiction treatments. Opioid addiction often turn to heroin once to more expensive prescription painkillers like OxyContin and patented form of oxycodone. Combating the epidemic. About a third of the Snohomish County deaths occurred in a town called Everett, which has a total population of just over 105,000. Everett's mayor, Ray Stephenson, will do everything in his power to combat the growing issue of opioid abuse. Recently, he announced plans to sue Purdue Pharmaceuticals because they knowingly turned a blind eye to illegal sales of the addictive drug. In 2016, a Los Angeles Times investigation uncovered a massive network of doctors and pharmacists handing out thousands of these highly addictive pills, which were then sold illegally on the black market. According to the investigation, Purdue was well aware of these massive orders and illegal trafficking, but failed to report them to the U.S. Drug Enforcement Agency, otherwise known as the DEA. As reported by Natural Blaze, these disturbing revelations come on top of prior investigation that found Purdue maintained a secret database of 1,800 doctors suspected to systematically overprescribe opioid painkillers, which flooded the black market across America, giving rise to the current heroin and opioid. Of these suspicious cases, only about 10% were reported to law enforcement. Placing profits over the welfare. Until 2010, 160 milligram oxycontin were widely popular as users could sniff or inject the crushed pills for a powerful, long-lasting high. When OxyContin was reformulated to prevent abuse, addicts switched to heroin. Purdue has claimed for years that the potential for OxyContin addiction was very small, or less than 1%. In 2007, however, the company pled guilty to that it misled doctors and patients about the addictive properties and misbranded the product as abuse resistant. Purdue's improper actions of placing profits over the welfare of the citizens of Everett have caused and will continue to cause substantial damages to Everett. Lawyers from Everett wrote in a complaint filed in the state superior court. Purdue is liable for its intentional, reckless, and/or negligent misconduct and should not be allowed to evade responsibility for its callous and unconscionable practices. Therefore, Stephenson and the town are suing Purdue for negligence, blaming the pharmaceutical company for the high rates of heroin addictions and overdoses. Relations of the Los Angeles Times, they hold Purdue accountable for allowing criminal trafficking of a dangerous opioid prescription drug, which has resulted in millions of dollars in city costs and countless ruined lives. Thanks to OxyContin trafficking, heroin is now an enormous problem in Snohomish County. Jails are packed with detoxing addicts. City blocks are turned into drug markets. Crimes involving OxyContin or heroin dramatically went up, and countless of people have lost their homes. While Purdue has been sued numerous times before for committing OxyContin, or try that again. While Purdue has been sued numerous times before for promoting OxyContin to doctors and masking the addiction risk, the Everett lawsuit is the first to focus on the company's knowledge of illegal trafficking. It says, stay informed about the criminal practices of modern medicine at medicine.news and drugcartels.news. Have that. The next one that I have for you is off of Natural News, and it says, how medical news became manipulated, industry-funded science throughout the 20th century. Now, let me grab a swallow of water here real quick. When it comes to accurately reporting the news, there is definitive limit to what reporters are allowed to cover, especially when they are fully immersed in the culture of what has come to be known as the mainstream media. There are certain topics that you just do not touch in this realm, unless, of course, you want to be fired or relegated to fringe status, which many of the best reporters over the years have sadly come to realize firsthand. The hijacking of news by special interests, and especially medical news, is hardly new, but the greatest disservice that it has done to the people of not only the United States, but everywhere else that censorship has prevailed, is largely underestimated. For probably the last 100 years, medicine and the advancements surrounding it have served sinister agenda that, far from helping people achieve true health, has harmed and killed millions upon millions of people throughout the printing of fake science medical news. Began to invade medical schools and change their curricula right around the turn of the 20th century is when things really went south. Doctors began to treat symptoms rather than copiously search for the root cause of the illness in order to facilitate their proper healing. Medicine switched from a system that embraced comprehensive immune support to one where pharmaceutical drugs became the answer to everything, much to the detriment of public health. Vaccines and pharmaceuticals have replaced sound nutrition and common sense sanitation and hygiene. The average person knows next to nothing about which foods and herbs might naturally help him or her avoid disease, but likely knows that popping an aspirin will relieve that nagging headache. And perhaps the biggest culprit driving this mass ignorance is the media, which has been complicit in hiding the truth from people for many decades. Worse than terrorism, American medicine kills at least 225,000 people annually. Investigative journalist John Rappaport is all too familiar with media censorship, having withdrawn from its clutches back in the 1980s when he first observed on. In the arena of vaccines, for instance, Rappaport recognized that stimulating the immune system to produce antibodies is not a reliable indicator that someone is immune from a disease, as antibodies also show up when a person is diagnosed with a disease. How reliable is that? Or what about our system of medicine as a whole? which a prominent science paper published in the Journal of the American Medical Association, or JAMA, back in 2000 revealed is responsible for killing at least 225,000 people living in the U.S. every single year. It's so harmful, in fact, that statistics now show it to be the third leading cause of death in the U.S. behind heart disease and cancer. As a matter of fact, that 2.1 million people in the United States are hospitalized every single year due to the reactions or side effects from medications that have been approved by the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. In total, 36 million Americans suffer adverse reactions to FDA-approved drugs every year, and yet you will rarely hear a peep about this serious epidemic. Everything from the way certain diseases are diagnosed to the way they are treated is a byproduct of a failed system that, thanks in large part to cowardly journalists who refuse to take a stand, is only continuing to consolidate power and bring more death and destruction to our planet. Smart. He got out while he could and has since made a name for himself as a brave, truth-telling journalist with high rapport in truth-telling circles. But many others outside of the fold, some of whom know the truth but refuse to tell it for whatever reason, continue to toe the line at the expense of untold millions of lives. And the final article that I have for you this morning is off of Natural News. It says entire global food supply to be contaminated by genetically modified organisms used for pest control, warn scientists. Next generation of genetically modified organisms may not involve produce at all. It appears that the next phase of GMOs will involve living things, insects. Genetically altered bugs could indeed be coming to an environment near you. Experimental releases of GM insects were already approved in 2014, but now there are growing concerns over what such bugs mean for the food supply, especially organic foods. Can organic food grown with or near GM bugs still be considered organic? That one bridge too far. Will organic produce grown in the United States still be able to be exported to countries like Europe if these GM bugs have developed on them? Organic produce growers be forced to forfeit their organic label? These are the questions that Guy Reeves from the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Biology in Germany and Martin Phillipson, Dean of Law at the University of Saskatchewan in Canada, are asking. Their goal is to shine a light on the potential perils that GM insects could bring to the food industry and to hopefully prompt U.S. officials into regulatory action, and so organic food growers don't have to fear losing their reputations. GM bugs, and why are they being made? Genetically modified bugs have been created to improve, and I use that term lightly, version of pest control techniques. By altering male insects to only produce other males, scientists hope that they can quell female populations. By keeping female insect populations low, a total decrease in the species population numbers can be seen, and in some areas, the affected insects may become. For the last 50 years or so, scientists have been exposing males to radiation in order to render them incapable of reproducing. The male insects would still be able to mate, but none of the resulting eggs would be viable. Leads to decrease in the total population of insect species. Both approaches can successfully decrease pest populations. The advance to using sterile insects is to control pest populations is that it eliminates the need for pesticides to kill insects. Insects have been proposed as a way to combat disease-causing bugs. For example, in 2011, some researchers proposed that GM mosquitoes could be used to help combat dengue fever. These creations may be used for farming despite there being an already effective non-GMO approach. If the use of GM insects for farming purposes becomes widespread, it could spell problems for organic farmers who wish to remain organic. This risk stems these GM insects are inherently intended to fly between farms. The research team also reported on several applications related to GM insects. The following application for mass open release of genetically modified insects for agricultural pest control have been submitted. 2011 withdrawn by the applicant, Spain in 2013 and 2015 withdrawn by the applicant, USA 2005 to 2011 approved. Releases took place at isolated locations in Arizona desert. New York State 2014 to 2017 approved, then withdrawn by the applicant in March of 2016 and November of 2016. All permit documents were withdrawn by the regulator. The permit allowed for the release of genetically modified diamondback moths 72 times per year until the end of March of 2017, with release of up to 100,000 moths per week on cabbage or broccoli fields totaling 40,500 square meters. Organic farms at risk. Releasing genetically modified insects into the environment will be the most concerning to organic farms. Reeves from the Max Planck Institute explains, there are some realistic circumstances where the mass releases of flying genetically modified insects could harm organic farmers and erode consumers' confidence in their product. Unfortunately, we can find little evidence of efforts to reduce the risk or even discuss the issue. Based on legal case studies from across the globe, the duo has surmised that any detected or conceivably perceived contamination of crops that are being sold to countries that have not approved the presence of GM bugs is likely going to result in import bans. This in turn would inevitably upset the entire international food trade. For crops that are certified organic, the GM insects raises even more concerns. In addition to negative consumer conceptions, there is a very real potential GM insect releases may lose their organic certification. Does this seem fair to you? Given that the risk of GM insects spreading beyond their desired location is pretty much a given, companies who choose to use them would have to be fairly dense to try to pass the damaging effects these bugs will have on organic farms as accidental. All I have for you today, unless we get some breaking news or something, but if you like what I'm doing here, give it a thumbs up. Share it on your social media so everybody gets to hear the news. Don't forget to subscribe, and that way you'll stay informed.